Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about liberty again. Of course, I am a libertarian, civic nationalist, aka American libertarian. They are the same thing. Elsewhere in the world, they might not be the same thing. Here they are, though. The founding goals and ethos, the founding principles of our nation, are all built on the concept of leave me alone, mind your own business. The first motto used upon American currency was not "In God we trust," was not "From one many." The basic concept, the first motto that was used was actually literally, you can actually obtain these coins, they're fairly rare, was "Mind your own business." I think that's a pretty good way to govern a nation. There are literally no risks whatsoever to maximizing personal liberty. I say that in a sense. There's one exception that's been taken up by the classical liberals of our era, let's face it. The modern day libertarian movement is not entirely the same as the classical liberalism of the revolutionary period. It's not quite the same as our founding. For instance, there was never anybody in that era who would have suggested an open border system. There was nobody in that era who would have suggested that assimilation shouldn't be encouraged or mandatory for a person to segue into your nation. The concept of the nation state for thousands of years was that if foreigners want to come in, that's all well and good, but they will respect the law. There will be a process involved in them coming in. If they're coming in physically, they will obey the law. They will assimilate to the culture. We're not going to bend over backwards for people that are coming from somewhere else. As well as the idea of taking land, the idea of imperialism in its sort of primordial sense is completely natural to mankind. I will say that the postmodernists who argue, oh, it's some great coup, it's actually not. It's the way that human beings did business for virtually all of their human development. You can bicker all day over whether it's moral or not. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. To the victors go the spoils. I would say this, though, at the same time. For instance, point number one. What you see in Europe and parts of the U.S. and so forth today is the same thing that you saw during the colonial period. It's just inverted as to where the donor culture is and where the host culture is. That is, Europe is being overtaken, it's being colonized by groups that do not assimilate, partially because the politicians there have not caused them to assimilate and have actually prosecuted their own populations to keep them from mentioning that it's a good thing to do. To the point at which you have, in urban areas throughout Europe, you have subcultures, which do not actually follow the laws of the reigning culture at all. They have their own paralegal system, so to speak. For instance, you do have Sharia law active in the UK right now. On British soil, it's very funny. The same country that once ruled about a fifth of the world's surface is now one small island with a little tiny chunk of another, and increasingly is giving up its own autonomy in favor of a multicultural system. Now, I've pointed out many times, a multi-ethnic society is capable of flourishing if there's assimilation going on into whatever the dominant reigning culture, the civic nationalism happens to be within a given era. It's possible to do that. A multiracial culture can exist. But a multicultural nation cannot continue to exist. It will be destroyed. One of two things will happen. The native culture will be displaced by a foreign culture. It will continue. At some point, that foreign culture becomes numerous enough to overtake the nation entirely. Or the native culture will militarize. They will force out the foreigners. You usually end up getting fascism or something like that. In neither of these cases is good days ahead. In both cases, you generally have a great degree of violence. So what would happen in a couple of decades as the multiculturalism, aka displacement of Europe, continues, some of these urban areas will no longer be, they will be majority minority, and this will begin to spread out into the suburbs as well. It will overtake the political systems of some of these cities and regions within these countries. Now, of course, it would take a hell of a lot of immigration or migrants or something to displace a significant enough proportion of a nation like France or Germany. They have high populations, but think about a nation like Slovenia or Portugal, somewhere with a lower, population total. They would be hard pressed to maintain their actual culture. We see even here in the United States, in 5 decades, we've gone from almost homogenous, where, white European stock individuals comprised, 85% of the population or thereabouts, to a nation in which in another generation or maybe 2 generations, according to current figures, whites, so-called, would be a minority within a nation that they themselves crafted. Now, I will disagree with this in one way, because most of the Hispanics in the country are of European stock as well. The fact that they happen to have native blood in them, from Mesoamericans, doesn't really matter, because then a lot of the settlers that came from England or France or wherever, they intermixed with Native Americans too. It didn't cause some great upheaval in U.S. culture or anything like that. It's not going to resemble Brazil. What it will is it will mix over time. The foreign cultures end up being the ones. If you have a stable political system, the foreign culture gets absorbed genetically, becomes assimilated, and you don't have any problems. We've successfully done this several times in our nation's history. When the Irish came over, they weren't considered, they were called Iberians, and they said, well, they're black, they just happen to develop white skin because they moved to the British Isles like thousands of years ago, and they always get drunk and stuff. And they were successfully absorbed. Nobody, I think, at this point considers the Irish to be a non-white minority group. They're part of the reigning culture. They've assimilated more or less, other than, the cuisine and some of the celebratory and religious features remain unique. That's not a problem. That's also not multiculturalism. The fact that a person is celebrating a foreign heritage doesn't mean that they're not obeying U.S. law and so forth. As far as liberty goes, though, within a culture, assuming you have a political system functioning properly, that is causing the assimilation of people who are coming in, making sure that there is law and order, in a literal Trumpite sense, I would say. As long as that's happening, within that culture, if your borders are protected, if things are generally stable, maximizing personal liberty is the least risky thing you can do. You run a far greater risk. I think we've seen this by giving the government too much power. The same groups, by the way, I'll make an interesting aside here. The same alt-righters who ramble about how the government needs to be empowered to, crush the border situation and force people at mass deportation and so forth, don't even seem to understand that the reason why those problems exist in the first place is because of immigration acts from times past that the government was empowered to make. That is, the government was the problem to begin with. In fact, this is invariably the case. They say, well, we shouldn't have gotten involved in the Second World War. By the way, I agree with you. The government was empowered to do that. We shouldn't have gotten involved in the Middle East. Again, it was the government that got us involved in the Middle East. It wasn't the native population didn't suddenly cry out for blood and start arming up and start a partisan movement and build their own ships like we might have done back in the Revolutionary period and go sail over to attack Tripoli or something like that. That didn't happen. What happened is that the government, manning a standing army, decided to go invade foreign nations, making everybody else in the country less safe in the process. As far as moral issues, I would say the same thing is in effect. The same people that, for instance, want the government to have the power to limit the rights of gay people or the rights of women to have an abortion would cry foul if that government, using the same legal arguments that it would need to make to adopt that power unto itself, were then to go after Christian morality, Christian religion or something, or say, well, it's going to be happy holidays and not Merry Christmas in the malls this year or in D.C. in general. Giving the government more power to try to stamp out your opponents is a bad idea, because your opponents at some point are likely to have power as well. We've seen this. For instance, I'll point out the hypocrisy of the left here. It's actually very funny. I should probably make a separate video on this because it's so amusing. Right now, there's a push among the left in the United States to dismantle the domestic surveillance and drone programs because they're afraid that Trump will have access to the ability to spy on his political enemies and conduct drone warfare on ISIS, I guess, maybe with nuclear weapons or something like that. Were these people concerned when Bush instituted these programs? No, because they didn't know the programs existed. Many people pointed them out at the time, that government transparency was lacking. Have they been upset over the use of the drone program to kill several tens of thousands of civilians under Obama? No, because instead of an overt war like W waged, Obama prefers a covert war. That is a war that is more silent, it's less obvious, but it's still there. The same people are still dying. Most of them are civilians, a lot of them are women and children. They're still getting splattered all over the mountains and steppe and sand dunes. But you don't care if you're a leftist because Obama has a D after his name and happens to be black. And that's the reason why. They don't care if he violates your privacy and puts you on some government list. They don't care if he splatters civilians over there in the third world. They're simply worried that Trump will do exactly what Obama's doing to groups that they themselves happen to like. It's the most sheer form of hypocrisy. The basic concept is still unconstitutional, regardless of which president or incarnation of Congress is making use of such programs. And therein lies the danger. This, by the way, I was accurate throughout the election, and it would behoove the alt-right perhaps to listen to what I have to say, even if I'm a civic nationalist, again, a libertarian, as opposed to, I'm not a Ramsey Paul figure or something like that, I suppose. If the alt-right really, really wants to improve things in the United States, they will take up at least a few of the lines of the libertarian movement. I'm not talking about borders. I happen to agree more with the alt-right on our borders than I do the Libertarian Party. Libertarian Party's far away from classical liberalism, actual revolutionary sentiment on this idea. As far as assimilation goes, people like Johnson don't seem to care if it occurs. I do care, because I think we need a monoculture. I don't care how multi-ethnic it is, but it needs to be monocultural. There's one set of laws, there's one reigning general cultural ethos, assimilate or fucking leave. That's what we need to have in place. Every other country around the world in all of human history has had that same tactic in mind. It works. It preserves the culture. I don't care where the immigrants are coming from, but they need to obey our laws. There needs to be a system in place to actually control the border to some degree, and right now we don't really have that. But the alt-right, the groups that are being empowered now, that have been they've been suppressed over time, gotten more and more angry. Now they're starting to gain power. They're starting to gain numbers. They're starting to gain intellectual strength as well, I would say. Mainstream forces are talking about them for a reason. Remember, first they ignore you. Well, they're not ignoring you anymore. You're beginning to rise up the ranks of Gandhiism or something like that. My suggestion would be don't trust the government with that power. Do things yourself to the best of your ability and shrink the government. Because therein lies the solution to most of our problems. By the way, the left should embrace this idea too. They're so worried about, evil Trump is going to kill a bunch of people, evil Trump is going to do this, evil Trump's going to do that. Well, you wouldn't be worried about that if the government hadn't adopted those powers in the first place. Now, the fact that you trusted Obama with the same abilities is laughable, because Obama's the warmonger in chief. He's no less of a warmonger than W ever was. He's the same goddamn thing. It's just that it's a covert war. It's by drone instead of by land forces marching in and debilitating everything in their path. The fact that you don't see as much about it is also due to the fact that such a covert war is less clickbaity. It's less interesting for the media to report on. So the only time you hear about the drone program at all, the only time you're interested in it is when they accidentally hit a hospital or an orphanage or something like that. As long as they're only killing 2 or 3 civilians at a time, most of which have nothing to do with any militant movement, you don't care. That's how blind you are to the American left. The American right, though, is guilty of the same crime. They did the same thing under W. They completely ignored it when he became an imperial president. They ignored the Patriot Act. They said it was some great thing, a reaction to 9/11. They should have read a little bit more into it. They would have realized what a bad idea it was. Congress has completely abdicated its responsibility to declare war, to the point at which now they can simply say to the president, yeah, you can go bomb these people. It's okay. It's not really war because there's no ground troops involved. Which, of course, is a crock of shit. It's still an act of war under any sane definition of the same. We shouldn't be involved in all these things. We should preserve our culture. We should leave other countries alone and let them preserve their cultures. Europe needs to do the same. If they want to be stable, if they want to survive, if they're worried about, oh, our population's going to drop off, then pay your people to have more sex. Pay them to have more children, or something like that. Bringing in people from cultures that do not want to assimilate, that in some cases don't even want to be in Europe, as is the case with a lot of these refugees. They actually blame you for bombing them in the first place, and they're right to do so. That's a recipe for dangerous situations. You see the proliferation of problems in Europe now to the point at which even multiculturalist commies, East Germans like Angela Merkel, which is exactly what she is, she's a throwback to the pre-fall of the wall East German bloc, even she is admitting that the refugee program has a few problems. Now, she's not willing to go out and say, well, it's an abysmal failure, which is closer to the truth. But when Angela Merkel starts talking about how there are problems and they need to restore law and order and people need to start assimilating and obeying German customs, you know that things have gotten way, way out of hand. And this is the case in France. This is the case in Austria. This is the case in Sweden. This is the case in the UK. I don't advocate starting, Fourth Reich, World War III now sort of mentality, which appears to be what the neoliberals and neocons of the world are really worried about. I don't see why they're worried, though. They should have seen this coming. We've seen it before. Period of social alienation, like the period of modern art, Dadaism and so forth, previous to World War I. We saw the social alienation of some nations prior to the Second World War. People were so despondent, people were so mind-numbingly soul-crippled, that they started casting around for any utopian ideology that claimed that it could lift them out of their problems. That's why many of them embraced communism. That's why many of them embraced the Third Reich. There were 1 million people gathered together in New York to praise Hitler. Prior to the start of the Second World War, they had a huge rally, swastikas and everything to stand in solidarity with Hitler. Why do you think that is? It's because those basic concepts, when you have that much social stress, and it's often, previous to it, is often influx of refugees, influx of immigrants, social alienation driven by lack of assimilation. It's the same story over and over in man's history. You get that situation going, fringe parties, either real or imagined, in their fringiness, will rise up, they will gain dominance, because the arguments that they're making capitalize upon the fact that most mainstream individuals are feeling at least some social stress. It's common knowledge. It continues to work that way. It always will. You get a group of foreigners in. Let's say they only comprise 5% of your population, but you're on hard economic times and the government's throwing them welfare. Whether it's a little or a lot makes no difference. A party will rise up and say, look, they're wasting money on people who don't even respect our laws, while our own native population suffers. We've got veterans in the streets. We've got orphans. We've got widows. We could be paying for them. We could be expanding our infrastructure. We could be becoming wealthy over time. Instead, we're frittering away our money on this foreign conflict and this group of people who's not part of our culture and so forth. And this is a prelude, in many cases, to war. It's a prelude to purges. It's a prelude to civil war, foreign combat of various sorts, imperialism, Nazism, communism, anarchism, all of these different movements. If the globalists of the world were really concerned with maintaining their sort of boring status quo, they wouldn't be pushing these populations over the brink with unlimited immigration, and by installing political heads that don't even encourage assimilation. In fact, in the case of people like Clinton or Obama, they actually frown on the concept of assimilation. They want the native culture to assimilate to foreigners. You see this with Merkel. You see this with most Swedish politicians, for example. Some of them are openly hostile. They openly talk about the displacement of their native culture with a sort of glee. And yet people haven't already kicked them out. It's astonishing to me. Even in the most liberal parts of the United States, say a state like California or here in Vermont, if a politician, if a governor, were to say, oh, well, I welcome the coming destruction of our native population to this, foreign group of people, whatever that foreign group happens to be, they'd get kicked out. They'd get kicked out within a week, even in the most blue parts of the United States. And it's so much worse, though, in Europe. Can you imagine? I've posited this before. Can you imagine what would happen if like 10 million Christians from Europe suddenly flooded into Pakistan and settled there and started demanding welfare, started demanding their own legal system to run alongside the Pakistani legal system, demanded that they be able to construct Christian churches on Islamic sites, demanded everything else under the sun? Do you think that they would get it? No, I think they would get a bullet. I think they would get forced back out. They'd be in exile somewhere else. They'd have to go into the mountains of Afghanistan to eke out an existence, or maybe flee over into India. Maybe the Hindus will let them do that. It wouldn't go over so well. And yet in Europe we see that it operates in reverse, to the point at which the legal systems, the political systems, favor people who aren't part of those legal and political systems. It's a way to force the population into a severe state of paranoia. Either real or imagined, they think they're going to get displaced. Doesn't matter if it's true. It doesn't matter. As long as the argument can be reasonably made by some political movement that they will be, they'll take up that banner. Therefore, because you have these periods, because number one, governments are responsible for these problems, invariably. It's not the people of a country, it's the government that's at fault. Then why would you want to give it more power? It's the fault of war-hawking, neoliberal, neoconservative foreign policy in many cases that there's a pool of refugees to actually flee into a place like Europe. So again, why would you want to empower the government to be able to do that, to wage a covert war? Oftentimes, if you had more liberty in these countries, people would not be, the native population would not be censored from saying, this is a problem, we need to reverse course, this is crazy. They wouldn't simply be labeled racists or xenophobic or ethnocentric or something for opposing the concept of the native culture being completely destroyed, which is encouraged explicitly again by some of the fringe leftist politicians of Europe. And so I would argue that it would be better to take up the banner of freedom, increased personal freedom, especially as related to free speech, especially in an electronic format like the internet. The internet is the greatest thing that we have right now to fight ineffective policy, regardless of what its source is. It has to be protected at all costs. Anything that would censor speech on the internet should be done away with if it's extant, prevented if it's being proposed, because that way all of these different groups are capable of engaging in debate. It shouldn't be shilled up by governments either, fielding, millions of sock accounts and crap like that. The Russians do it. The U.S. military does it. The CIA and FBI, I'm sure, have their sock account shill armies. Certainly there are different sub-political movements, like the Clinton campaign. They had CTR. They had thousands of shills. We know this. It's on paper. We know that it happens. Obama had his Truth Squad, which will be going the way of the dinosaur. It's important that we fight these things wherever we see them, because otherwise we're going to get screwed at some point. Remember, the last time that we had enough social alienation to spark a world war, we didn't have atomic weapons, let alone multi-stage hydrogen bombs in the world. It'd be a little bit problematic if it were to erupt today. It'd probably take a lot more lives than the last time around. That's about all. Peace out.